Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's program. This is our part of our monthly Hot Topic series, Human Origins Today. And today's program is A Colorful Path, What the Ancient Pigment Ochre Tells Us About the Modern Human Mind, featuring archaeologist Tammy Hodgskiss. My name is Briana Pobiner, and I'm a paleoanthropologist and educator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. I'm a brown and gray-haired woman wearing a dark shirt with a multicolored necklace in front of a Zoom screen with an African savanna photo with grass and an acacia tree behind me. Whether this is your first time joining us for our hot topics or you've attended before, we're so glad to have you here. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping notes. This discussion offers closed captioning. You can turn the captions on or off via the CC button, which should be located at the bottom of the Zoom interface. We're in a webinar format. We can't see or hear you. So as you have questions, please go ahead and submit them to the Q&A box, which is at the top or bottom of your screen. It looks like two speech bubbles, so that we can sort through as many questions as possible. The Q&A time really flies by. The Q&A box is also where we will share any relevant links during the program, so keep an eye out there. We'll start with an opening presentation by our speaker, Dr. Tammy Hodgskiss, and then I'll join her here to take your questions. During the presentations, I will also write answers to some of your questions, as will Dr. Ryan McRae, part of our behind the scenes team here in the Human Origins program, at least any that either of us can answer. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Dr. Tammy Hodgskiss is the curator at the Origins Center Museum at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Tammy is an archaeologist and received her PhD in 2013 from Wits University. She researches ochre use in the Middle Stone Age with a research focus on how this can help inform interpretations of social behaviors of people in the past. As the curator at the Origins Center, she's responsible for exhibitions, lectures, and public programming at the museum. She also runs interactive ochre workshops involving ochre pigment and paint creation. I participated in one, it was super fun, and archaeology-inspired painting. So now I'd like to turn this over to Tammy.
Hello, everybody. It's awesome to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Let me get my screen share going. There we go. Cool. Yes, I'm going to talk about ochre, something that I'm very passionate about, and I'm looking forward to interacting with you all afterwards. So what is ochre? It's a very, very broad term, and archaeologically, there's still debates as to what it actually is. This is a beautiful picture of an ochre source, Roussillon in France, but archaeologically, it covers a whole range of different types of rocks, from mudstones and even sandstones to shales and hematite and specularite. It's a very, very broad term. Even hardened clays would often get put in the ochre category and in archaeological assemblages. And so you're dealing with a lot of different types of rocks, a lot of different makeup of rocks, but generally rocks that have a pigment that you can get a streak out of them, and usually a streak that's yellow, orange, or red in color. So it's a mineral pigment. And what do we know about it? Well, we know that it's found all around the world. There's different, iron is the most abundant element in the Earth's mass. And so you find iron-rich rocks all over the world, and these are they're in different states of weathering, different elements that have caused the rocks to form. And you find the picture that I have on the top left is Lion Cavern, or viewing from Ngwenya mine, where Lion Cavern is, where you find the earliest ochre mine at about 40,000 years ago. But there's mines all around the world. You'll see there's all different colors and all different types of rocks that have been collected. And today I'm focusing on South Africa, but it is something that is used by humans, is still used by humans, and is a very special, and I kind of think a humble rock. And we know that you find it's the main pigment or the main element that is used as a colorant in rock art pigments, and usually the reds and the yellows and the oranges. But we know that it was a lot of the rock art that we find in the past was imbued with a lot of symbolic meaning. It wasn't just an art form. And so we do think about, was ochre one of these parts of the paint and one of the aspects of the paint that actually was important as well. You know, it was often mixed with blood or something to make the paintings more supernaturally potent. Was that something with ochre as well? We know that it's used as an artist's pigment. There's a lot of artists that use natural pigments, and it's one that is relatively easy to process. Ochres, obviously, you get different hardnesses, but you get a beautiful range of colors, rich colors from these different types of rocks. And again, mostly the yellows and reds and oranges, but some purples, and then you do get a wide range of colors of ochres. And I've just put up some beautiful phrases here. So in Southern Africa as well, you get quite famously the Himba, who cover themselves with a red ochre paste, and they use it for ritual, but also as a sunscreen. It's a skin protector. And you see especially women, but also men and children cover themselves in this beautiful red paste that has a lot of ritual and cosmetic value to the Himba. But a lot of groups have around South Africa have this recorded history that maybe has been stopped now, but this history of using ochre for very different elements in their lives. And one thing that I've enjoyed looking into a little bit, just kind of anecdotally with people that I've worked with or come across, is looking at the different terms for ochre. And in different languages, South Africa has 12 official languages, and more that are unofficial and unrecognized. And amongst those languages with different language groups, often there's different terms for different types of ochre. It's not just a red rock necessarily. It'll be described by whether it's a dark or whether it's shiny. And so that kind of shows that, especially since Africa is oral history is so important, and it shows that this rock had meaning through time and has been passed down from generation to generation. So we know that it's also used as a sunscreen. It's the Himba in Namibia have a very low skin cancer rate, and it's thought that maybe their tradition of putting this beautiful red paste on their bodies and covering their whole bodies with it adds to that. And Rian Rifkin did some experimental work looking at the sun protection factor of these red ochres and found that red ochre actually has a higher SPF than yellow ochre. And it's about 13, I think, so not compared to the crazy high sun protection factors we get now, but still something that's really useful. And to think back in the past, if people were traveling long distances in the sun, and something that needed also protection from mosquitoes, for malaria. So it's something that we need to consider when we're looking at archaeological ochre. You also get these beautiful balls of, it's actually kaolinite, that you can buy from muti shops or medicine shops, where that is used for healer training. So you can even buy the iron oxides that would be bought for industry at a hardware store. You can actually, those are used often as a sunscreen as well, and as a supplement if you can't get these beautiful red clays. So it's something that's still widely used. You can even buy some of the more chalky varieties of the ochre. You can buy it from markets around South Africa and other places in Africa as well. And sometimes pregnant women buy it because they crave it. The different, maybe the calcium in it and the iron in it. It's also eaten to treat stomach cramps. I still haven't tried it. I should. But it has a lot of medicinal properties to stop bleeding. It's got an antiseptic quality, so it can be used to treat wounds and burns, so internal and external medicine. And a lot of this isn't very well researched, so it's definitely an avenue that I think there's a lot of cool research that could be done into that. And then also high tanning. It has an antibacterial and an antifungal properties. So it could have been used in the past to tan hides. We would then see it on the stone tools that it was used with, because most of the time the hides wouldn't have actually preserved. So it's something that is still used now to actually stop the decay process with these hides. So it's a very versatile rock and a versatile mineral that is widely used around the world, as I said, and something that even in Middle Ages, the picture on the bottom left, it was said that there was actually used in wedding bed sheets and used in bed sheets to treat rashes. It was, red is this powerful color. It's associated with blood and passion and love. And, was this something in the past? The associations we have now, it seems to be something that you find through time. The Venus figurine in the middle, found in Austria, was said to be covered in ochre when it was found. And so, why are we putting ochre with burials? Is it something that's important? We're showing this beautiful red color, or is it something to help with the decay process? So it's a lot of these different things that we need to look at when we're interpreting ochre, going back to when we first became human. We have to have all these considerations. And so now I'm going to focus mostly for the rest of my talk on the South African Middle Stone Age. So the Middle Stone Age starts from about 300,000 years ago, when we become anatomically modern humans, or when we find the first evidence of it. And then ochre use mostly comes in, it starts around then. So from about 500,000 years ago even, you're finding a few sites that have ochre being collected and brought back to the site, maybe not used, but being brought back, maybe as a special object. Why would it be brought back? And then, especially from about 100,000 years ago, you find ochre being used habitually at a lot of these sites. So I thought I'd show this picture. It's a really nice map from Hodgskiss. Now I've said your name wrong, sorry, if you listen to this. But it's a really great map from his PhD research, that the little red triangles around the map show the sites, Middle Stone Age sites in Africa that have ochre found at the sites. And you can see that there's a lot of sites in South Africa. And that is possibly because there was a lot going on. The environment was right. There was a lot of hominin activity in South Africa at the time. But it's also probably to do with the archaeological research that's been done. There are some areas in Africa that are difficult to get to because of civil war or the environment. And so there's a lot of different factors at play. And I'm looking forward to the next 20, 50 years of research, and hopefully a lot more research done in Africa to understand this movement of people around the continent and their interactions with ochre. So some of the sites that I'm going to be chatting about, or that are important in the uses of ochre, they're these beautiful sites. They're often these sites that have this sense of just this beautiful, almost sacred spaces that might have been habitation sites. Some of them maybe were sites that were went to for special purposes, like Blombos Cave on the top. It's a site that has a huge amount of ochre. I kind of think of it as the ochre mecca. So from 100,000 years ago, there's so much use of ochre at Blombos Cave and at a lot of these sites. And they, really beautiful sites to work in as well. You can imagine why people visited these sites, and that they've helped with preservation. Again, obviously the cave sites are the main sites where you're getting a lot of this preservation. So the question is, when did we become cognitively complex Homo sapiens, or modern humans? And how do we see this in the archaeology? And with the use of ochre, and with a lot of this whole set of skills that we kind of wanting to see, okay, were we cognitively complex? We see really nice stone tools, really fancy stone tools that are really difficult to make. So innovative technology. We find bone tools, tools that are being hafted, put onto handles to make knives or spears. We're finding engravings, so that it wasn't something that has a functional purpose. It presumably had a symbol outside the body. It was a message, perhaps, or some kind of marker. The perforated shell beads that you find as well. All of this around after 100,000 years, 80,000 years ago, you're finding at these sites in South Africa. Or the use of insecticidal bedding. So just understanding the environment a lot better, and what plants to eat, and cooking food, and using sites differently. You see this use of space around sites, or you start seeing deliberate burials, and the understanding of transforming materials. So heating silkweed to make a better stone tool. Or bringing objects back onto the site, like crystals or like ochre, that you find all this ochre being collected, but only a really small portion. Most Middle Stone Age sites only have about 20% of the ochre that's actually found at the site. Only 20% of it is actually being used. So it's all these interesting things that are happening around the Middle Stone Age, and with that comes the habitual or the more regular use of ochre. And so why were we using ochre and how were we using it? It's a little bit easier to speak of how, and that's what I'll talk about now. But why? Can we see that why in the past? And how can ochre use especially reflect these changes and these cognitive and behavioral innovations that we see and are starting to see in the Middle Stone Age? So what we know, as I said, majority of the pieces aren't used in any way, but they are brought. Most of the sites don't have ochre naturally occurring there. They're brought to the sites. There's a preference to use red pieces. So even if yellow pieces and orange are available, most of the pieces that we find being utilized I mean, it's a generalization, but at a lot of the Middle Stone Age sites, you're finding these red pieces being used. And there's a focus on producing powder. So a lot of the pieces have been abraded or ground against a grindstone, and that the engravings that you find are actually quite rare, and that there's quite a consistent use of ochre through time. It would be unusual to find a Middle Stone Age site, in South Africa at least, that doesn't have ochre. And so what's been important in understanding ochre is getting this champ opératoire, the production sequence of ochre, and what was all the steps that are required to get the ochre that we see now, or the things that we see, that the different artifacts that are used with ochre or have ochre residues on them. What was that production sequence, and what were the cognitive requirements for each of the steps? And so what has been my main focus with a lot of my research is looking at the useware. So the different traces that you find on the ochre pieces, looking at it under a microscope and figuring out how that's done. And a lot of that experimental useware has been very important in helping that, understanding how, when you hold a piece differently, how that affects the piece. And so taking a piece of ochre and grinding it against a lower grindstone or braiding it against a grindstone is something that you find mostly, at a lot of sites, you're finding a lot of that. So producing powder, it's a really effective way of producing powder. Sometimes you get pieces as you're doing it that form a strange shape, usually dependent on the shape of the piece beforehand, or where your hand gets tied, the best way to hold it. And so that's quite good with understanding these crayons that you find. Quite often at sites you find ochre that are the shape of crayon. And it's not necessarily that they were used as a crayon directly on a surface, but that it was part of the grinding process. And it's something quite important to consider when you're interpreting, how it was used in the past. And so then the evidence of this is the pieces that you find, but then also lower grindstones that might still have residues of ochre on them, which you don't find very often. And then also it's messy. When you use ochre, you get mess everywhere. You just have to embrace that you're going to be covered in this red powder. And so then you're often going to find that in the archaeology, and morphological studies have really helped with that, to understand that there's a lot of ochre pieces and powders that we're finding in the sediments at these sites that may not be visible to the naked eye. Then scoring or engraving. So I like to differentiate between the two. Engraving is much more deliberate. It's intentional, so most likely symbolic. There's some reason why these lines were drawn over to sometimes form a pattern. They would have needed fine motor control and be able to, to manipulate a sharp tool, and then to get the tool in the first place. And then scoring is something that could have been done. It's much more erratic, also using a sharp tool, but to just create powder, something that we might have, I don't know, done as kids, just scraping a rock, and it's fun to get the powder out. And that's something that you'd use a sharp tool, but you get a lot of like a mush of scrapings along the surface. And so what we'd find with evidence of that is sharp tools. You'd find residues on the working edges of tools, and on these tools that we use to score the pieces. Then rubbing. So this is something that's, would likely happen, especially when you have soft pieces of ochre, that you'd rub it directly on your skin, if you're wanting it on your skin, or on hide, even in the process of tanning a hide. And different markings form on different pieces depending on the hardness. And it's something that's hard to tell archaeologically, because you have a piece that's been in the ground for 100,000 years, and maybe in wet soil, it's going to become smoothed. But it's something that we do need to look at when we're wanting to figure out the whole process that ochre went through. And then crushing, of course, it would be quite easy to just take a piece and crush it with an upper grindstone and to try and get this nice fine powder to use for whatever, we don't know. Or picking at a piece of ochre. And then this is something where you'd find, and you do find it at some of the Middle Stone Age sites. The picture here is at Cebudu in the middle, and in Wadley, and the piece, it's a nice hard surface that has ochre all over it. So it might have actually been used as a working surface. And then the ochre that we find on it was during the crushing process. So that's something that we might not have much evidence of because pieces would be completely used up. But we would have, if it is crushing, you presume you'd still have lower and upper grindstones that would have residues of ochre. And it's interesting, we don't find them very much at sites, at least the ones that I've worked at. And so, I mean, I'm using lots of pictures and lots of examples, and there's so many different researchers' work that I'm drawing on here. And so some of the applications of ochre, as I've spoken about, is finding the ochre on the edge of tools, or finding it on the back, the pieces in the middle by Marlies Lombard. They little segments, teeny little segments that have ochre staining on the sides, and they were likely hafted with the adhesive that was used with ochre in it. I'll talk about a little bit about that just now. But the two pictures of shells at the bottom, they're abalone or perlemoen shells, where at Blombos as well, where you're finding ochre paste being made, mixed with other things into a nice paste, and the shell was used as a very handy container. Or you're finding ochre being drawn on a little fragments. So we're finding all these residues on whether it's sharp tools or being used for other things. So going back to the hafting of tools, looking at why ochre was added to these tools, not on the sharp edge, not on the working edge, but on the backed edge. And was it something like this? Is a really nice, these are just some experiments or some tools that have been made for displays, looking at, was ochre a good adhesive? And there's been different studies that say different things, but it seems it could add to the adhesive and actually make a better adhesive, but it could maybe have been added because it was red, it blessed the hunt, or it symbolized blood. We don't know. So there's definitely more that we could do experimenting with that. And then looking at some of the other objects that are found with ochre on them. And the big picture on the right is from Pork Epic in Ethiopia by Daniela Rosso. And I just highlighted the big picture of number 5 at the bottom. And it's just a beautiful round pebble, and it's got an ochre. You can see the line of ochre directly through it. It's almost used as a stamp. And so there's a lot of these other implements. When you're looking at ochre, there's other things that you need to get that whole chain of operations. You need to look at other objects as well that might give indications of how the ochre was used and what it was applied to. And with the shells, the staining that we find on some of these shells from 70,000 years ago, was it because maybe ochre, now you use jeweler's ruse, which is an iron oxide, which is essentially what ochre is, most ochres are made out of. It's used as a polisher for gold jewelry. And there's been some studies looking at, was ochre actually used as a polishing abrasive for ostrich eggshell and other types of beads as well. So there's a whole lot of uses potentially for ochre, and it's quite important to look at the whole assemblage altogether. And it's not just about the color; it's also about what its physical properties are. And then just quickly, I want to look at ochre pathways. So there's been a lot of research focus lately on looking at where people got ochre from, because we're most likely dealing with these humans that had a lot, were presumably like us. And how far did people travel to get ochre? Were there these lines of communication or exchange? And is there a preference for certain sources and certain types of ochre? And I think it's best to start with Blombos Cave, that there isn't a source close by, and these sites that I'm going to talk about now, they don't have sources nearby, and you're finding the sources that we do find. Beth Bellicky and Brandy MacDonald are doing awesome research. I can't wait to find out more about what they found. But a lot of the sites that they've looked at is it's quite a different type of ochre than you're finding at Blombo. So it looks like there was this preference. The type of ochre that you have, this engraving, which is, I don't think I mentioned, is dated to 77,000 years ago. It's often called the world's oldest art. And there's different types of ochres that you're finding around, beautiful colors and amazing ochres, but not necessarily what you're finding at the site. So there does definitely seem to be this preference to use a certain type of red ochre and a blood red, harder ochre, not these soft shales that come in beautiful colors. And the same, this is at a site Uliboomsputten in Popo. There's a recent paper out by Jasmine Cooley and myself and other awesome people, and there's this a specularite, a really dense, shiny, almost hematite or a specular hematite that is red, I mean gray on the outside, and then when you crush it up or you grind it, it's got this beautiful purple shiny quality to it. And this most likely forms naturally in the sandstone. So that's what this paper has looked at, and is likely that, you know, we don't really know where the source is. There's definitely a bit more research that needs to be done there. You know, where were they collecting it from? Why was this the ochre that they wanted? And similarly at the sites in Mulus, where you're finding these beautiful shales all around, but you're not finding the type of ochre that was being collected and brought back to these sites. So there's a definite preference to bring back sites. And then I just wanted to show the site in Eswatini, Lion Cavern, as well. It's now used as had been used as a commercial iron ore mine. But Lion Cavern itself, it was dated to 40,000 years ago and used as a mine. And it's the red, beautiful red, almost fatty ochre that was collected. So there's a preference to use those quite widely. And we're finding that throughout Africa and a lot of sites around the world. There's this focus on red ochre. And so something that we need to think about is how the environment impacted this. And, you know, were there at times of resource stress, some just kind of preliminary studies that have been done along the coast of South Africa. It looks like there's a correlation between ochre use and resource availability. So perhaps ochre was used as the signifier, you know, when there's a bit more resource stress, that there's more ochre being used, or different types of use where. So maybe ochre was being used as a social symbol or signifier, but also used as something like a sunscreen or used as a supplement. So there's a whole lot of factors that come into ochre use, but it's generally in Southern Africa, you're finding this preference for red varieties and not necessarily collected close by. So it was a resource that was valued. So we need to look at all the different applications that I've spoken about, the potential applications, what might have been the social and physical needs, whether there was access to certain sources, movement of people around the landscape. Was it maybe based on communication or a need for a certain type of ochre? And that would have been impacted by environmental conditions. But we know there was a desire or need to collect these beautiful red ochres, and that ochre use becomes habitual around the time that we're finding all these different signs and in the artifacts of cognitive complexity and behavioral innovation in Homo sapiens. And so it does seem, you know, that ochre was used for a whole lot of various purposes, but a lot of those actual processes do require some kind of behavioral complexity and most likely some increased brain power, like our brains today. And then just to end off, I think something that has informed my research a lot and kind of my passion for ochre is the research, the workshops that I do at Origins. I've had a lot of feedback and a really good understanding of ochre, what people understand of ochre, a whole lot of different ways that people might have remembered their grandparents using ochre. And it's been really important for me, even though it's difficult to make connections to, you know, people that lived 100,000 years ago. It's something that has really informed my understanding of how ochre may have been used in the past. And then I'm part of an awesome pigment community. So if any of you want to understand pigments better, it's called Pigments Revealed International. It's a wonderful community of artists and researchers and pigment enthusiasts, and just a really nice way of sharing different interactions with different natural pigments. And then oral histories, I think, especially in working with ochre, I think there's so much that has been passed down, this huge wealth of knowledge of indigenous communities around the world that is often passed down orally. And there's so much knowledge that I think we still could learn from. And it's something that, yeah, that I hope to do more in my understanding of ochre as I get more into my research. But yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening, and I'm looking forward to getting questions. Please do get in touch as well afterwards.
Wonderful. Thank you. That was fascinating. And it was delightful, again, to see the pictures of the ochre workshops. As I mentioned, I was able to participate in one of these several months ago, and I learned a lot about ochre during this. And I'm going to jump right into questions because we already have several. I'm going to start with one from Niels, who asks, is there early chemical evidence for ochre being mixed with oils or fats or other substances to make something like paint?
So the only evidence actually is the one at the moment, or the word very rare, is at Blombos. So this is at 100,000 years ago, the Perlemon shell that was mixed with animal fat, likely, or we're not sure, and charcoal. But you don't actually find it often being mixed. So it's something that maybe it just hasn't preserved in the containers that it was mixed in, but you don't find, at least in the Middle Stone Age, going to about 30,000 years ago, you're finding residues on tools. So, some of them you most likely had to have been mixed with something. It had to have been some kind of paste. But a lot of the organics that it was most likely mixed with, same in rock art paint, the organics haven't preserved.
Right.
And so we left with little bits of the evidence that would have had to have been mixed with something. But I recently had a conversation with a colleague about whether binders were even used for the rock art paint, because you don't necessarily find them. So even if they're a few thousand years old.
Here's an interesting question from Rosalie, who asks, have any taphonomic experiments been conducted to see whether ochre either aids or hinders decay or has no effect and therefore is purely symbolic? There was some thought that it symbolized the blood of rebirth.
Sure. Yeah. So as far as I know, it does, because it does for hide tanning. So it actually does have an antibacterial, and it actually, it helps, or it has different properties that help the breakdown of collagen. So I think for burials, it could have been used, like lime, is used. It could have been used for something like that. But it's still something that is used, I think in archaeology we see more death than birth, and so we'll see the buried bodies that have ochre on them, and and so then it could have a dual purpose. But there's a lot of instances and communities still that use ochre at birth or at wedding ceremonies, which is like big birth, to a new family, and so it's something that we might not see in the archaeology, but I think it's quite likely that it was used for that too.
Okay, thank you. And actually, this question follows on really nicely. One from Darren, who asks, did the Xhosa use the ochre to dye their materials for clothing?
So from what I've done very little dyeing of ochre, but as far as I know, it's used quite widely in the Eastern Cape, where Xhosa is spoken, and so it is something that is quite likely to be used as a dye. But yeah, I know when I've tried to dye it, I know nothing about dyeing, so you'd probably need something else with it, and it could be used, but I don't know if it was used traditionally. By the Xhosa specifically. Yeah.
Steve asks, speaking of sort of use and creation, do you see evidence of red ochre produced by heating yellow or brown ochre?
Yes. Yeah, that's something I didn't even get onto in my talk, but yes, it's something. So usually if you're heating to over what's 250 Fahrenheit, so about 400, I mean 250 Celsius, so about 400 or so Fahrenheit, so relatively hot, but not that hot. You get a really nice transformation, so from iron oxyhydroxides to iron oxides, and so that as it dehydrates. And it's something that I often think of. A lot of these archaeological sites have a lot of hearths or fireplaces, and you do think, you know, how much of someone coming 1,000 years later and making a fire on top of sediment, and you know how much of that is actually responsible for some of the red ochre we see in the archaeology. But yeah, it's quite cool. It's quite magical. I think, you know, if people were already, they understood how to heat silkreed to make a better stone tool, you know, to suddenly get this beautiful red pigment, the stone kind of transforms from yellow to red. It would have kind of been a magical transformation.
Here's a question, somewhat related. Caitlin asks, have there been any studies on how or if ochre powder affects the lungs, especially after long-term exposure?
Yeah, as far as I know, and it's actually something that I wasn't aware of, you know, because I'm like, oh, you can eat it and it's fine, it's safe, but it does, some of it, because there's such big varieties in it, but it has metals in it, and some of them have aluminium and different things in it that could be detrimental. I think especially if you are you know, exposed to it a lot. But there was, yeah, I think ingesting, even, I mean, there's some people that will eat soil, and there's been some research done on, again, what, you know, with heavy metals that are in the soil, how does that affect? So, you know, certain things in the soil might be fine, but it depends specifically. But breathing it in, I know some of the one of the ladies that in Pigments Revealed, she has a mortar and pestle when she's processing ochre, and she puts a sock over it so that she doesn't breathe in any of the little particles that come off. I've definitely breathed in a lot.
I know, I was looking at that question going, maybe you are part of an experiment you could do to figure that out.
Yes.
So hopefully no negative effects.
Yeah.
Here's a question from Alicia, who asks, has there been any meta-analyses about what they chose to use ochre for in Paleolithic cave art? Are there any patterns?
So, I mean, I think with the cave art, in terms of the specific figures that it's used for, or
Maybe.
I'm not sure, because it's I know in Europe you get a lot more manganese, so you get a lot more black pigments as well. And I actually not sure, in South Africa you get some white pigment, but you're mostly getting reds and yellows and oranges, and black isn't actually used that much. So the red is kind of so prominent. But in terms of in Europe in the Paleolithic, I'm actually not sure. But it just seems like, yeah, I mean, in a lot of the figurines that you find, and I don't know, you are finding a lot of the red, but yeah, I'm not sure of that.
And actually, I'm gonna ask now. Our behind the scenes group often will type some questions that we're interested in, and one of our questions was, why do you think red pigments were so preferred in Southern Africa? And now that you say that black and manganese were used more often in Europe, do you think it's a just distribution of what's available, or do you think there were different sort of cultural or color preferences?
Yeah, so I mean, you do find reds being used around the world. There is this thing for the reds, but I know of very few manganese or dark, you know, mineral pigment sources in South Africa. So it's quite easy to find different shales and mudstones and in reds and yellows around, much more than any dark pigments that in the sites that I've worked at. So it might be something to do with that, what's available. And even though you do find, you know, ochre sources and different varieties around, it's mostly, it would depend exactly what the geology is like in the country, I think. And that probably, which is quite interesting that a lot of the sites where they've done this ochre sourcing, there's kind of still not sure where the ochre was actually from. It's not necessarily the ochre source that's close by. You
And
know.
did they do the sourcing using chemistry, like of specific elements to match the ochre at the, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so and then looking also between the rock art pigments, now that we can do nice non-destructive analyses as well. Yeah, looking between, how far people were traveling for rock art pigments in more recent times. Yeah.
I'm going to jump in with another behind the scenes question because this came up as well. Do you think that any MSA sites in particular might have been like specialized ochre processing sites, that would have been the main function of those sites?
So the site actually that I worked at with my master student, Jasmine, most recently, that is what the interpretation was, because you find so much of this kind of heavy specular hematite, and hardly any of it is used. And so it was thought that, okay, they were bringing it back and this was a processing site. I think something that would help with understanding that is looking at the micromorphology, so looking at the sediments and actually seeing if there's a lot of ochre that was actually being processed that we don't find now. But I mean, I think Blombos is probably the best example. There's just so much ochre stuff going on there, that it seems like it was a site that maybe was the place to go to get nice ochre. I mean, I don't know.
Right.
But yeah, you'd think you'd find it a bit more, and just because you do find it at so many of the Middle Stone Age sites, it's hard to say.
So here's a bigger, broad question that I really like from Niels, who asks, is the early use of ochre one of the first examples of humans transmitting cultural information? And what does it say about our development of language?
Yeah, so I think possibly, I mean, stone tools, I think, tell us so much as well. And at around the same time where you're having humans using ochre a lot, you're also finding these beautiful still bay points and stone tools that have just amazing symmetry that you almost don't need to have spent so much time on a tool. You can still use it really well without it looking so amazing. And so I think stone tools also tell us a lot about whether people would have needed language to be able to teach certain things, and maybe with hafting, if you're adding an ingredient into it, you had to control the fire, you had to have everything ready, you had to understand the consistency of the gum that you're using, then adding ochre. All of that, you most likely would have needed language to explain it. So there would have had to been that learning, not just by showing someone how to, make a chopper with, with older stone tools or something, that language would have probably come into it. And yeah, just having that actual communication visually as well, but verbally too, I think.
So I'm going to follow on. I had been answering questions from Walter, and who was interested in when socialization and communication first began. And I think a question I would have out of that is there any evidence of ochre being used by species other than Homo sapiens?
There is. There is. So, and now in Europe, there's, some of the rock art is mostly made by Neanderthals. And so there's a rare case in the Netherlands where they found just a few drops of this hematite kind of mixture at 250,000 years ago. So yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, it's really small little bits, but it shows, okay, this is actually a mixing of a pigment. And so you do. So it's, even though it's mostly Homo sapiens that we're finding it associated with, going back 500,000 years ago, it would have been, more archaic, that you're finding people or hominins collecting ochre and possibly using it a little. So yes. Yeah, so we kind of, I suppose as humans, we like to think that we did everything first and amazing, but I think there were other things going on, and especially because ochre does have other practical uses and not only as a pigment or for art. It could have been something that was used. So.
I have a few more behind the scenes questions for a moment. One is there any way to tell whether red pigments were naturally occurring or did they have to be heat produced?
So that's one thing that I've done a little bit of research into with Marine Wojciech, and we've done some experiments to look at that, whether we can the use where you can kind of determine if it was naturally occurring or if it was heated, and if use where that you find was after it was heated. So, you know, like with the silkcrete, you can tell that the stone tool is made after the silkcrete was heated, and not just heated in, you know, accidentally. And it's something that, you know, the jury's still out. You're finding if it's heated to really hot temperatures, you can find things like if there is manganese in it, mangan oxide, another compound kind of forms if it's heated to really high temperatures. And there's certain features. You have some cracking on the surface. But yeah, whether to say high temperatures were intentional is also a little bit tricky. When you're having you know, you'd get really high temperatures under a fireplace as well.
Right.
And yeah, and my research into that is kind of you're finding certain things that might form, but because you have so much variety in the types of ochre, and even in one piece of ochre, one half can be yellow and one half can be red, you know, and they have quite different mineralogy depending on the layers. It's quite hard to say, but yeah, I'd like to think there is, and maybe people that understand the chemistry better than me will will be able to figure that out.
That's why we like, you know, working interdisciplinary with colleagues is the best way to answer these questions. Exactly. So I have a question that came in from Alicia, I think, following up on what we were talking about any, you know, other species using ochre. So Alicia asks, did Neanderthals use it for burial as well?
Oh, sure. That's actually a good question, because I'm not sure about the Neanderthal burials, actually, in the first place. I'm actually, I mean, it's really, I mean, my research is so much focused on South Africa and Southern Africa that actually, it's a good question, something that I must look into. But yeah, most of what I've come across, it's Homo sapien burials that have used it. But that's a good point, something we need to look at, and just generally Neanderthal objects, you know, that are associated with species.
Here's another behind the scenes question. So maybe ochre is easier to pick up on the archaeological record because of its color, but do you think there were other non-pigment minerals being used and processed for medicinal or other purposes in the Middle Stone Age? And what kind of physical evidence would archaeologists look for that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think of with rock art pigments as well. You know, surely that I don't know, people would have had a need. I have during the ochre workshops, people ask me, but I want purple, I want green, you know, I want something else, you know, I need some blue.
Right.
Especially kids, you know, they need the sky to be blue. And I do think, you know, surely there was other, especially organic pigments that were likely used in some way, and then that's just something we don't see, especially in the Middle Stone Age. But you don't find that much in the rock art either. But I think, I mean, it is something that we do need to consider, you know, when you are looking at when you do find tools, grindstones or stone tools that have residues on the working edges, is to look at how, you know, how mixing whatever is found on it, how it changes over time. Could it have had a color 40,000 years ago, or mixing it with milk, or you know, with gum, mixing certain substance with something else could also change the color. And so, I mean, I think that's where experimental archaeology is awesome, and kind of understanding how these substances mix together. But yeah, it's something, I mean, I don't know of much research into that at all.
So here's another one of our behind the scenes questions that might be maybe answerable by experimental archaeology, but the question is, if ochre has medicinal properties, is there any way to tell whether humans were using it for coloring or ingesting it for medicine?
Yeah, I think that's the frustrating part of it, is that we don't know, and I don't think we could, you know. So it's more about understanding, you know, maybe what types of ochre are more likely to be ingested, and say, okay, well, people were collecting that even though there isn't a source close by. There, you know, why are they bringing this in? Or to look at certain types that make really good pigments, but don't have a lot of iron or something, maybe that's some way of guessing at it, but I think we can't know. And we can kind of draw on these modern applications, but also you have to be very careful going back 100,000 years ago when we still not sure, were humans the same as us now? Would they have thought of ochre in the same way? We kind of need to be careful with how we interpret it.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of 100,000 years ago, I think as we were taking notes behind the scenes, did you mention something about like insecticidal bedding 100,000 years ago in your talk?
So that's at Cebudu, and it's dated, my memory, I think it's 70,000 years ago.
Okay.
But they found this beautiful, so it's sedge bedding. So you get quite a nice organization of the space at the site, and you're finding sedge bedding and insecticidal leaves. And then there seems to have been routine burning of this bedding to presumably get rid of, almost to clean the site. So it's pretty cool. And I mean, the research is amazing. You can actually see the beautiful leaf pattern. I mean, it's amazing that it's preserved for 70,000 years.
Wow.
Yeah, so I mean, and the more that we know, and as archaeological methods get better as well, we can, there's a lot of cool evidence that does preserve, that's helping us understand what people were thinking and doing 70,000 years ago.
So I think we are done with the audience questions. We have one more behind the scenes question, and then I think we'll wrap up unless more audience questions come in. Does the timing of ochre use and personal adornment, so things like perforated shell beads or pendants, does that timing coincide, or does one appear in the Middle Stone Age or other sites before the other?
It's about at the same time. You're finding, so ochre, I mean, you find ochre being collected, but at about the same time where ochre ochre use is becoming habitual. So you're finding lots of sites with ochre, and lots of ochre, and ochre being used in different ways is around this time that you're finding this evidence of, the perforated shells and engravings and things like that. So it does seem to be around that time interesting things were happening, whether it's a period of resource stress, it could have been something that there was just this need, people were getting together, or they had to think really innovatively, which I suppose would have also changed our brains in some ways, ultimately, possibly. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. And so I'm going to conclude today's virtual program. So please join me in the audience in thanking Tammy for sharing her work with us. I'd also like to give special thanks to those who made this program possible, to our behind the scenes team who helped sort through your questions, including Dr. Ryan McGray from the Smithsonian's Human Origins Program, to our donors, volunteers, and viewers like you, and finally, to all our partners who help us reach, educate, and empower millions of people around the world today and every day. We thank you. As I mentioned in the introduction, this is our last Hot Topic program for 2023. We will pick up again in 2024. On January 18th will be our first Hot Topic program for next year at 11:30 a.m. And that program will be Archaic Introgression in Modern Humans. What can it tell us about archaic humans and ourselves? And that will be with Dr. Fernando Villanueva, a population geneticist and professor of anthropology at the University of Colorado Boulder. We've put a link in the Q&A where you can find information about our upcoming programs and how to sign up for the museum's weekly e-newsletter. That's the best way to stay informed on upcoming programs and to learn more about the museum's research and exhibitions. After this webinar ends in a moment, you'll see a survey pop up asking for some feedback about the program. Please take a moment to respond. We're very curious to know what topics you might be interested in seeing for future programs, and we appreciate your input. So again, thank you to our participants. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to Dr. Tammy Hodgskiss, and Happy New Year, everyone. We'll see you next year.